Hello and welcome to 2026. This is our first podcast for Beyond the Mekong. It's broadcast by the Diplomat. And with me today is Marcus Tantau, who is a senior securities analyst with Templeton Research. And Marcus, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Lee. Pleasure to be on.
It's going to be a hell of a year, given what 2025 was like. Your specialty is in investment and risk and finance, but that also takes in the political equation. How do you see this year shaping up, and what's installed for, we're looking at a lot of countries within ASEAN, Southeast Asia, but there's also there are big divides emerging between them, which we have forecast before, particularly between maritime Southeast Asia and mainland Southeast Asia. But what's your best bet?
Thanks again for having me on, Luke. It's, I'm a big fan of the show, and it'll be good to chat with you today.
Stop it.
I think what we're seeing is, things are off to a flying start, particularly in the investment climate in the region. I think obviously the biggest market in APAC obviously is China. You can't really speak about the region without speaking about China.
Sure.
And what's sort of happening geopolitically between the US and China is going to have a huge impact on investment in the region. And we've been seeing that for the last few years. I mean, I think even since Trump won with the first set of tariffs, that sort of started off a chain of investment, pushing Chinese companies outside of China into Southeast Asia, which has obviously continued until the present. And we're still seeing a lot of that. I mean, outside of China, we're also seeing a continued investment from North America, from Europe, as well as investment from within ASEAN itself. But I mean, if you want to sort of talk about who are the best performers, how do all these countries rank?
Well, Vietnam's a standout. I mean, they're looking at 8% growth, but going back as old as I am over the last 30 years, Vietnam's always been interesting because it tends to do very well when the rest of the region is not. It's one of the few countries that is knocking up 8+% growth a year. And these are the sorts of figures we were used to 10 years ago. Now, I mean, they're all boasting, we've got bigger GDP growth than, say, the West, running at 4 to 5%. But in a lot of these smaller developing countries, that's not a lot.
Yeah, I mean, Vietnam is obviously one of the standout performers, and it's kind of interesting. I feel that even within ASEAN, everyone's sort of looking to Vietnam to find out what is the secret sauce. I was in an investment event last year in Jakarta, and one of the slides that a public official from the Indonesian government put up was basically, this is what Vietnam's doing. How can we be more like Vietnam? But I think what the interesting thing about Vietnam is that when it comes to their investment, FDI into Vietnam, a lot of that is sort of reshoring that's happening into Vietnam from mainland China, with mainland Chinese businesses coming out of China to avoid these sort of tariff issues or tariff exposure, and sort of setting up shop in Vietnam. So there's a lot of that. But talking about GDP growth, the real estate market, the real estate sector is actually seeing a lot of growth as well, and a lot of that is coming from this sort of growing middle class and people basically wanting to put their money somewhere. Hopefully there isn't a bubble that we've seen in mainland China, but Vietnam seems to be still very strong. We've been seeing a lot of interest, foreign investment interest in Vietnam that continues to be seen. But I think as well, when it comes to investment in Vietnam, one of the things I think maybe Indonesia overlooks is, if I'm using it as a comparison, and only because my background is more Indonesia focused, but I feel that Vietnam as a market, as from a foreign investor's perspective, it's a very plug and play sort of market. You can sort of come in, there's one regulatory framework to sort of follow, and you click in and then you can run your business. It's a lot more easier than, say, we'll just say Indonesia, for example, where you're dealing with different regulations at, for example, the provincial level, at the federal level, or sometimes even at the sort of city or regency level. So I feel that that's where Vietnam sort of got a lot of its growth from, and a lot of investor interest, as well as that, it's 100 million people wanting to buy stuff, growing middle class.
Is it also perhaps a bit of a reaction in that there's Operation Blazing Furnace and an enormous cleanup within the banking sector involving billions of dollars? A lot of that seems to have subsided. So are we perhaps seeing pent up growth, pent-up money coming into the market now that, and also we've just had To Lam re-elected as Vietnamese leader until 2030. So I'm kind of wondering, we've had this, the cleanup of the banking sector. Would that have helped out in terms of more money coming in and the extra growth we're seeing there? Plus, we've just had To Lam re-elected. So I guess that, that it's a sign of stability, which the market's like, and that could indicate continuing prosperity over the short term.
Sure. I mean, I definitely see it as a positive factor, amongst many, but, any sort of government effort to clean up corruption is only going to look good for foreign investors because,
Right.
outside of China, a lot of, investors need to follow the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and obviously don't want anything to do with corruption or bribery or anything like that. So I think this is probably a positive sign. It's working in Vietnam's favor, particularly when you're looking at maybe, its neighbors and how they deal with similar matters. So I think that's sort of something where it can give it a comparative advantage for sure.
Right. Hey, we'll get back to Indonesia, but while we're on Vietnam, the Vietnam was always lumped in with what they call the CLMV club: Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam. It's now the CLM club. Vietnam is out. And I do tend to see Vietnam more as a maritime nation, which is trading, Philippines looking to the American, Mexican, South American coast for exports. But, in its backyard, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Myanmar have had a hard time of it, given well, there's no way of getting around it. The criminal syndicates, the scam compounds, the collapse of Prince Bank, the deportation of Chen Ji, who was a war undeclared with Thailand. Thailand's got issues in the south with the Muslim insurgency. And of course, Myanmar junta has just completed its third stage of the elections, which was on Sunday, which I'm sure they're hoping to get some kind of legitimization out of that. But I don't see too many other Western governments, the UN, they've all come out against that election. Even ASEAN has said they won't be recognising the results. How do you see that lump of countries? They seem to have their own identity these days.
Yeah, I think when it comes to investment, they're definitely lagging behind their maritime neighbors. I mean, you could probably speak more than I can about sort of investment climate in Cambodia, but I guess just the sort of interest is very different. The sort of work I see that your investment interest, I guess you could
Mm,
call it, into Cambodia and Laos is tends to be more around development finance and that sort of thing, where it's looking into infrastructure, small scale infrastructure projects. I mean, I can't, that's sort of coming from North America, Europe in, rather than sort of China down. I'm sure there's a lot of investment from China coming into Laos and Cambodia. But I think one interesting point that you raised is sort of looking at Thailand as well, and your sort of points around stability. I think that, when it
mhm,
comes to investment, investors just want stability. And Thailand, we've seen, before this actual conflict with Cambodia, we've seen a
yeah,
long period of political instability, which is not a good sign. We've also seen the Thai baht appreciate in value, which makes things more expensive to buy from Thailand. We've also got some other sort of economic headwinds, like high household debt in Thailand. Yeah, when you count these things with the political instability, and there's other markets. When you look at Vietnam, for example, it sort of makes you think, well,
yeah.
it's not really a difficult choice.
Well, it's an interesting point. I mean, Asian countries love to point score against each other. They love their rankings and their indexes, which I mean, they are loaded, and it depends on who's writing them up. But Vietnam has scored a lot of headlines in that it's about to replace Thailand as the number two economy in Southeast Asia, and I think the Philippines will as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, just from an FDI perspective, if you sort of look at if you sort of look at the rankings, you've got Singapore first, you've got Indonesia second, then you've got Vietnam. And that's sort of, Singapore at 143 billion 2024. You've got Indonesia with 24 billion in 2024, and then
Mm,
Vietnam with 20 billion. And then you've got sort of Malaysia after that and Thailand after that, and then the other maritime countries, or other maritime ASEAN countries like Cambodia and Laos after that. But yeah, it does sort of seem like there's this sort of disparities increasing between the various economies. I
right.
mean, and as we've sort of touched upon, it's due to a sort of range of factors.
Right. And going back to Indonesia, how is it shaping up after Prabowo? I mean, there are lots of concerns about him, uh, given his track record on human rights. He was banned from going to the United States for 20 years. They finally relented because he was defense minister, I think. And the Indonesians have had a difficult year with riots, cost of living, floods. What's happening in Bali is making it almost a no-go area in terms of tourism. It seems to be it seems to, it's got its own quagmire to crawl out of, but Indonesia's been there before.
Yeah, I mean, it's still a very attractive market. We're still seeing a lot of investment there, a lot of investment going into manufacturing, a lot of investment going into wholesale and retail trade, healthcare, that sort of thing. But like you said, that under this Prabowo administration, we've seen some sort of I like to call it carrot and stick policy making, in the sense that when it comes to, I mean, the Prabowo administration seems to be extracting concessions from corporates. For example, we saw at the very start of his presidency that there was a ban on the iPhone 16 Max or something. I can't remember the specific model.
Sure.
Basically, it was, we're going to ban the sale of this phone in Indonesia unless you sort of invest, a large chunk of money into the local economy. And, this sort of quid pro quo arrangement, it doesn't sort of set things up well in the eyes of investors. We also saw last year the Prabowo administration force Grab and Gojek, which, for those of people who don't know, are two of the largest ride-hailing platforms in the region, basically forcing them to pay a Ramadan bonus to all their drivers. And this is not a small amount of money. This is a lot when you've got millions of drivers sort of working as gig workers for your business, and forcing them or twisting their arm to sort of pay those bonuses. And in my mind, that doesn't really set up a great sort of, it doesn't really fill investors with confidence when these sort of regulations or policies that are sort of coming out that seem to be more populist in nature, rather than sort of thought out, rather than being well thought out, essentially.
Right. Okay. It's well, it's that Malay kind of area, which, well, obviously the Philippines is different for many historical reasons, but Indonesia, Malaysia, Anwar Ibrahim, it's difficult to gauge where Malaysia sits because it's had a high-profile year as chair of ASEAN, and it has won quite a good deal of respect given its handling of the undeclared war between Cambodia and Thailand. And there were elections in Sabah in Borneo, which, it's a bit of a litmus test, but his popularity doesn't seem to be as great as it once was. How is Malaysia holding up in the eyes of investors?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's personally having a bit of a renaissance. I mean, it's not going to sort of become a developed economy as quick as I think it had used to.
Well,
as
they've all got signs on that. Yeah.
Yeah. I remember going through LCCT airport a long time ago now, and I remember seeing that, though, by 2020 something, Malaysia is going to be a developed economy. And then you sort of had the 1MDB scandal and everything after that, and it sort of and sort of this circus of different political leaders coming in. I mean, while I don't think maybe Anwar Ibrahim has been the sort of reformer that everyone thought he would be, I think in regards to investment, yeah, as I said, Malaysia's having a bit of a renaissance. It's, in 2024, it had $11.4 billion invested in the country. Majority of that was actually into data centers, which is really interesting. So I think when you look at Malaysia, you can't, as I sort of said about, you can't look at ASEAN without looking at China. You can't look at Malaysia without looking at Singapore. And I think the Johor Singapore economic zone, which came into place last year, that's sort of setting up a whole lot of frameworks, making it easy for investment between the two regions. And for those that don't know, Johor Bahru is the sort of Malaysian territory that borders Singapore. That's giving businesses 5% corporate tax rate. It's allowing speedy times through the borders and that sort of thing. But, we've seen half of that FDI, which that half of that 11.4 billion, 5 billion of that solely going into data centers. So that seems to be driving a lot of its growth. On top of that, as I'm sure you're aware, and most of your listeners are aware, we're seeing a huge interest globally into semiconductors. Malaysia, which has had an industry in Penang since the 1970s, is now sort of reaping those benefits. Obviously, it's not as the sort of products that they're making aren't as sophisticated as what's out of Taiwan. It's lower down on the supply chain, but they're able to build on that foundation, and you can really hear the government's messaging around that. They're really pushing for further development of this semiconductor industry, and as a result of all this investment, as all of this renewed interest in Malaysia, the ringgit was the best currency out of the basket of ASEAN currencies last year. It grew 9% against the USD. So they're it's good for Malaysians who are looking to go for maybe a holiday abroad. But yeah, I mean, that'll just shows that there's more interest in the market as a whole. So yeah, I think that I'm keeping my eye on Malaysia. It's a very interesting market, and I think we're going to see more investment as sort of Johor increasingly becomes the sort of, as Shenzhen is to Hong Kong, the sort of the same sort of version of that to Singapore.
Right. How is Islamic finance stacking up these days? I covered it quite closely there for quite a few years because I think after 9/11 and then the whole war on terror deal, people were looking for alternative ways of legitimate finance, and how do we do this amid this backdrop of Osama bin Laden and wars and all the Islamic militancy that was going on. And Islamic finance, it did emerge as a kind of a legitimate form of funding. Is that still the case? Is that an area to keep an eye on? Particularly, I mean, Malaysia's connections with the Middle East are quite strong.
Yeah, that's. Oh, sorry, Luke.
So, and I was just quickly going to add, and Brunei, which is often a country that gets left out because it's very tiny, but there is a tie in between Brunei, Malaysia, and Indonesia through Islamic finance. But yeah, please.
For sure. Unfortunately for Brunei, I due to my lack of knowledge on the market, just because it's a smaller market, I won't be able to provide too much context or background information on Brunei. But I think insofar as the Islamic finance industry in the region, it's definitely growing. I mean, as you said, I think Malaysia sort of had taken the lead, a few decades ago by having various Sharia compliant financial products available through their retail banking business units. But in Indonesia, we're seeing a huge growth in sort of Sharia finance. I mean, with a lot of the sort of state-owned banks spinning off their various Islamic, their various Sharia compliant business, retail banking business units. Sorry, it's a bit of a mouthful. Spinning those off and sort of creating them into their own business. We saw Bank Sharia Indonesia, which I think is the sort of flagship state-owned Islamic finance, Sharia compliant retail bank, which listed, I think, a couple of 2 years ago or so. But yeah, I guess my point is that it's sorry, not really my wheelhouse, but
that's all right. But it is going ahead by in terms of bond issues and that, and Sharia compliance and
for sure,
retail banking, particularly where interest rates are set in an Islamic way. It's all going ahead. But the one country that's kind of left out of our discussion at the moment, the Philippines. How is that shaping up?
Yeah,
I mean, they had the whole they attempted a Chinese love in. Then there was a change of government, Marcos, some time back. But how is the Philippines shaping up?
Yeah, I think in terms of investment, to be honest, I think it's lagging behind its neighbors, particularly when you look at its population, which sits roughly around the same level as Vietnam, around 100 million or so. I think it's the FDI coming into the Philippines in 2024 was half of Vietnam, and
right.
I mean, some issues which I think spring to mind focus around corruption. If you look at the news in the Philippines at the moment, there's some big political corruption scandals going on, and I think this is somewhat deterring in investors. The other thing, I think, one issue with the Philippines is I think that, I think back in the day it was sort of heralded as the sort of future, the next sort of big economy of Southeast
Yeah, it
Asia. And
was.
I think
It was a World Bank love child and
yeah,
IMF. I mean, it was under
yeah,
tutelage for a long, long time. But as with a lot of these, a lot of the countries within ASEAN, it's always the corruption that seems to get the better of them.
exactly. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, you saw a lot of sort of development finance institutions open up shop out there, but yeah, it
Mhm.
hasn't sort of met expectations. I think one problem is in the Philippines is that it's sort of rested on its laurels a bit, in the sense that it had a very large population, a lot of which could speak English. So they really went hard into these sort of back office services,
Right.
and really hard into hospitality, particularly with Philippines nationals going overseas, working in hospitality and
Well,
coming back.
that's the big point because the Filipinos
Yeah.
are no longer going overseas and doing the dirty jobs and doing, or singing karaoke bars. Engineers at airports in the Middle East are all over the planet doing all sorts of great jobs, but those sorts of jobs don't seem to exist for them at home.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. And I think that's because that the economy has relied so much on, these sort of remittances basically coming in, all of
Right.
these back office services domestically, that it hasn't really had to focus on building a sort of strong manufacturing industry, that they can sort of work their way up the value chain. So I feel
Yep.
like they're sort of stuck in this point now where they've got this huge population, young people wanting to work, but is there the right jobs for them? And I think you've pointed out that a lot of them are sort of looking overseas for opportunities. And when you can add in the sort of corruption element as well, and the sort of political, I mean, there is political instability to an extent, right? You have
Mm.
the Marcos family and the Duterte family now sort of going at each other pretty hard. It sort of also is another factor, I think, which contributes to the lack of interest when there's other more attractive markets that are easier to navigate in the region.
Right now, just on an overall perspective, because we'll try and keep this to within Southeast Asia and ASEAN, um, and we should mention East Timor as well, Timor Leste as they prefer, because they are the 11th member of Southeast Asia. But we'll get there in a minute. See if we can wrap this in. But
Sure.
Trump's tariffs, they seem to be kind of ad hoc. Uh, they, they vary from country to country. Are they having an impact at the moment? Is it really being felt on the ground? Who is paying for these tariffs? Is it the manufacturers at home, or is it really coming out and it's going to impact on the American consumer, which is really what everybody was forecasting when Trump first started touting this kind of diplomatic endeavor?
Mm. Yeah, that consumers, when you're looking at the impacts of the tariffs, I think I read recently, and this is, please don't quote me on this, but it didn't seem that the tariffs had resulted in the price of goods going up too much. I think when it came to
Yep.
consumer goods. So I sort of read this in passing. Please don't quote me on this.
Not to, mate, because we're recording we're recording live, which is a bit of an
Yeah.
oxymoron. But anyway, just tell me what you think.
Yeah, I think, I look quite a lot, as I've said before, Indonesia, that it's definitely sort of having an impact domestically. It's having an impact on the price of goods. It's having an impact on the rupiah, which is also
Right.
at its lowest against the USD. It's almost
Yeah.
17,000 rupiah to one USD. So I think uh, you know, in this part of the world, it's definitely having an impact. But as I said before, the sort of reshoring that's going on has also opened up the region to, businesses from mainland China coming down and sort of seeking new opportunities. So I don't think it's all sort of, yeah. It's not a step like a win or a lose. I think it's sort of mixed on the ground. Yeah.
Economies will find their own balance over time, which we are starting to run out of time. Actually, how do you see Southeast Asia as a bloc?
Yeah.
We haven't mentioned East Timor yet, or Timor Leste. But how do you see the small countries, the big countries? How do you think will be? How do you think they will be shaping up by the end of this year? If we have this conversation in early 2027, what do you think you'll be saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think personally that investment in the region will remain robust. I mean, out of all of the sort of developing regions in the world, Southeast Asia still has the most foreign direct investment. So that's a positive sign. I personally foresee that continuing. But I think, one quote that comes to mind is what sort of Mark Carney said, the Canadian Prime Minister said,
it was a hell of a speech.
It was. But my favorite bit was, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so I think when it comes maybe to the sort of geopolitical factors for the region, I think these countries are really going to have to sort of come together and start acting more like a bloc, middle powers coming together. I think that sort of opens up opportunity for, Australia to come into the mix, to be, so have some more sort of relationships with countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, that's sort of close to its maritime territory.
Right. And then we haven't got that much time to go into the weeds, but then we have the border peace, and even countries like Cambodia are considering the $1 billion price tag to get involved. And where does that leave the United Nations? But we might have to save that for another time. Marcos Tantau, thank you very much. Been a good cracking start to the year. Best of luck.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure. Thanks, Luke.